In 1969, historian and activist Vine Deloria Jr. condemned the use of the phrase Indian Wars. The application of Indian as an adjective to describe the nature of the conflicts between the Taino people who Columbus encountered when his ships arrived at the Caribbean was absurd. In his initial reports to the King and Queen of Spain, it is clear Columbus had militaristic intentions. He assures His Majesties that he took natives by force and used them to gain some information of what there was in these parts. Such intimidation was an act of war. Similarly, Columbus allowed the Tainos to think he and his men came from heaven. This was a strategy to maintain psychological superiority. Columbus affirms he conquered a large town which I have named the city of Navidad, and he assured the Spanish crown that if the Tainos attempted to reverse his gains, neither the Taino chief nor his subjects know what arms are, nor wear clothes. The occupation and renaming of Taino possessions signified Spain's aggression against Taino independence. For historian Vine Deloria Jr., then, it would have been more appropriate to define these exchanges as Spanish wars against Caribbean people. The English were no less bellicose. King James I, more than 100 years after Spanish arrival, assumed Spain controlled Powhatan territory. That is, that they had been already conquered by their European rival, and advised his generals to earn Powhatan respect so that the English could substitute for Spanish sovereignty. The English viewed the people they encountered in these foreign lands that they renamed Virginia as pawns of a European conflict between Catholic Spain and Anglican England. The English, by landing under such a militaristic frame of mind, they find their altercations with the Powhatans as a category of European warfare. It did not make the Powhatans aggressors that they cautiously approached the English adventurers who landed on their coast and whose intentions they mistrusted. The English were strangers in weird ships, dressed oddly and brandishing loudly freakish weapons. By 1607, stories abounded along the routes that indigenous people traded of the militaristic atrocities committed by European kingdoms on indigenous nations. Furthermore, if the Powhatans inevitably tired of English demands for food and assistance, well, most people do not take well to clingy and entitled foreigners. How could anyone conceive of indigenous Americans as irrationally hostile and instigators when it was the Spanish, English, and the French who invaded the Inca Empire, established a settlement on territory dominated by the Powhatan Confederacy, or looked to trade in Iroquois markets? Yet such was the perspective that Deloria Jr. looked to revise in Custer Died for Your Sins, an Indian manifesto. The interpretation he intended to revise was one determined by Europeans' notions that they had to subdue indigenous Americans to save them from their savage ways and protect the sanctity of Christian civilization. In the history Deloria Jr. told, he condemned Europeans as the provocateurs. Once the Spanish monarchy recognized that Columbus's discovery of the Atlantic granted Spain privilege, that is, relative to other European kingdoms, over these territories, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V immediately determined to possess these lands and convert its people to the Catholic faith. The requerimiento, Spanish for request or demand, was an official declaration of conquest read aloud in Latin to the native residents. Yes, it was read in Latin, and no, the Aztec were unfamiliar with this foreign tongue. The requerimiento gave the people it was read to a clear ultimatum. They could submit to Spanish domination, or if they resisted, then Spain and the Catholic Church promised that, with the help of God, we shall powerfully enter your country and shall make war against you in all ways and manners that we can, and shall take you and your wives and your children and shall make slaves of them. Evidence as such demonstrated Delorias Jr.'s point. The Spanish antagonized and exploited the Aztecs, Incas, and other indigenous people with coercive treaties. They forced them to convert to Christianity and to submit to involuntary labor for Spanish profit. In 1992, historian David E. Stannard maintained this critical perspective, similarly denouncing the adjective Indian to define wars they did not start. In American Holocaust, The Conquest of the New World, Stannard contended that the use of the phrase minimized the scale and nature of the violence committed against Native Americans. It falsely implied a series of conventional, mutual military conflicts between equal opponents. Stannard presented these struggles as one-sided campaigns of extermination, genocide, and ethnic cleansing by European settlers first and then the U.S. government. These studies intended to overturn outdated historical interpretations that define Native American nations as stubborn and culturally static. The narratives accused indigenous people of being so set in their ways that they failed to see the benefits of Western influence. American Indians refused to adapt to the improved conditions that Europeans introduced, and therefore their short-sightedness resulted in their loss of land and the decimation of their people. In this line of argument, the blame belonged to the conquered. The aggressive tactics applied by Spain, France, England, and the United States was the unintended consequence of the colonizers' attempts to save these savages from their backward and obsolete ways. Deloria Jr. and Stannard focused on the imbalance of power to demonstrate that there was no wars that could logically be described as Indian, but there were many episodes of Spanish aggressions, English violence, and double dealing by the United States. For these authors, Native American wars of resistance better categorize these exchanges. The notion that Native people instigated conflicts relies on the assumption that Spanish political ways, English religious ways, and Western ways overall were superior. This Eurocentric methodology of understanding relations with Native people originated with the first settlers who initiated contact. In the case of the English, the Puritan settlers framed the vacancy of New England by repetitively affirming that God intended this land for them. Of course, God's hand had nothing to do with these English zealots establishing a beachhead in New England. It was the diseases that Europeans had been introducing since 1492 that transformed native villages into ghost towns. Nevertheless, it was an eerie experience that Puritans rationalized as divinely ordained. One Massachusetts settler observed that fields rich in soil had been abandoned in the late great mortality which fell in all these parts about 3 years before the coming of the English. European diseases traveled the routes of Native American traders so that once the contagion commenced, it did not need the physical presence of European men and women to reach places far away from European settlements. Even though these English guests acknowledged the role of disease in the demise of the indigenous people. Their theology was the lens by which they understood the benefits and tragedies of the world they traveled to escape their homeland. Jonathan Winthrop, who led the second wave of Puritan settlers across the Atlantic and served as governor of Massachusetts, noted, God has consumed the natives with a miraculous plague, whereby the greater part of the country is left void of inhabitants. Thus, the Wampanoag, the Narragansetts, the Mohegan, the Pequot, and the other nations the Puritans encountered became natural enemies whom their God dispossessed for the benefits of his elect people, the Puritans. More than 100 years later, Thomas Jefferson remained true to this narrative when he attempted to convince the Seneca's religious leader, Brother Handsome Lake, that it was in the best evolutionary interest of his people to sell the majority of the Seneca's land since it would earn them more money to start European-style farms. Jefferson explained that the sale of lands is, under all circumstances, not injurious to your people. While they depend on hunting, the more extensive the forest around them, the more game they would yield. But going into a state of agriculture, it may be as advantageous to a society as it is to an individual who has more land than he can improve to sell a part and lay out the money in stocks and implements of agriculture for the better improvement of the residue. Jefferson's advice implied that the more progressive style was sedentary agriculture and that the hunting and nomadic habits of people like the Seneca constituted obsolete economic ways that wasted resources. Almost 30 years later, when the U.S. Congress passed the Indian Removal Act, this was the main justification. Distress could not teach them providence, nor want industry. As animal food decreased, their vegetable productions were not increased. Their habits were stationary and unbending, never changing with the change of circumstances. The idea strived that from the beginning, indigenous people fought for a lost cause, and that it was their stubbornness to accommodate to the ways of their ethnic superiors that resulted in their defeats. They lacked the will to survive and adapt. It was the Seneca's obstinacy, the Cherokee's pig-headedness, and the Seminoles' mulishness that forced the hand of the U.S. military. Deloria Jr. and Stannard's research intended to overturn these perspectives and demonstrate that the force applied against these nations was exaggerated and intended to annihilate them regardless of whether indigenous nations complied with European diplomatic ends. Moreover, Deloria Jr. and Stannard stressed that, right or wrong in their economic way of life, indigenous people had a right to live as they saw fit. It was their lands and their way of life that they protected. Thus, these wars they fought were defensive. Since then, other historians have condemned the use of the term genocide as an oversimplification of the complex interactions involved between both Europeans and the many native nations they warred against. Francis Jennings and James Axtell are two historians that have strayed from viewing the relation between the West and indigenous America as one of genocide, as the term is used in the 21st century sense. For example, while the traditional interpretation marked Native people as behind the times who struggled for a lost cause and Westerners as father figures who attempted to guide them into civilization, Jennings' work demonstrates that English civilizing rhetoric was purely self-interested. European colonies in North America were influenced by the economic needs of their mother countries. Their rhetoric was a means of being able to diplomatically use one indigenous nation against a European opponent in North America. Similarly, Jennings questions the need to victimize Native people. In contrast to Deloria Jr. and Stannard, Jennings demonstrated that Iroquois adapted easily to the changing diplomatic ways of the Europeans, many times being able to influence skillfully relations between the English and French to their advantage. Thus, for Jennings, relations were much more complex than the standard ways of defining Europeans as absolute oppressors and viewing indigenous people as total victims. Jennings forces students of history to see these relations in the context of the space and time they were happening, judging each historical conflict between indigenous Americans and Europeans relatively. In addition to this debate about indigenous intransigence and the benefits of modernization, or the victimization of American nations, is the problem that the word Indian suggests. There is no monolithic group of Indians whom the English and later US government battled against. No such group exists. The term Indian robs individual indigenous nations of their specific cultural, economic, political, and religious ways. The Iroquois Confederacy was a powerful alliance of 6 nations: the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, Seneca, and later the Tuscarora. The Confederacy was founded on principles of peace, unity, and mutual respect, as codified in the Great Law of Peace. The society was matrilineal, meaning descent and inheritance were passed through the female line, and women held significant power in decision-making processes. The political structure of the Iroquois was highly democratic, with decisions being made through consensus, reflecting a deep commitment to collective governance. In contrast, the Powhatan had a hierarchical and inherited political structure that was less democratic, with a ruling elite. They demanded tribute from the people they conquered, and diplomatically they expanded their territory by military force. Within the Powhatan nations, women had less power. Descent and inheritance were determined by the male line. The political structure was tightly controlled, with the elite class wielding significant power over the common people. Therefore, all indigenous nations differed, and while they shared certain characteristics, the people within these nations viewed their tribes as distinct. So, why is the term Indian Wars still used? Part of the issue is that it has become a cultural and linguistic artifact that we perpetuate through novels, films, folklore, songs, and histories. Therefore, its use is not always malicious. Many times its application is a force of tradition more than an attempt to demean the people who were at the losing end of these hostilities. Increasingly, however, scholars and the lay public are recognizing that this phrase is outdated and politically incorrect, laden with connotations that are both historically inaccurate and harmful. It encourages stereotypes of native peoples as inherently violent, while simultaneously oversimplifying centuries of complex interactions between indigenous nations and European settlers, and later the United States government. To better understand why Indian Wars is unsuitable for contemporary discourse, we must examine the term's implications and offer alternatives that honor the dignity and historical complexity of indigenous people. The phrase Indian Wars traditionally refers to a series of conflicts across centuries between indigenous nations and colonial or U.S. forces on the North American continent. This terminology glosses over the diversity of experiences, cultures, and political structures among indigenous nations. The conflicts were not monolithic. They involved distinct nations, each with unique histories and motivations. Moreover, the word Indian itself is a relic of colonial misidentification, rooted in Christopher Columbus's mistaken belief that he had reached the Indian subcontinent. This erroneous label, imposed by outsiders, has persisted despite its inaccuracy and its failure to reflect the identities of the indigenous peoples it purports to describe. Given the term's problematic nature, it is essential to adopt alternative language that more accurately and respectfully represents the history of these conflicts. Wars of indigenous resistance, for instance, emphasizes the agency of native nations as they defended their homelands, cultures, and sovereignty against colonial aggression. Similarly, conflicts with indigenous nations highlights the diversity of peoples involved, acknowledging that these were not uniform struggles, but engagements with distinct nations, each with its own governance, culture, and territory. Scholars and activists have also proposed using specific terms that reference the indigenous nations involved, such as the Dakota War of 1862 or Seminole Wars. This approach resists homogenization and honors the unique experience of each nation in its struggle for self-determination. It is important to acknowledge the broader implications of these conflicts. The term Indian Wars fails to account for the defensive nature of many of these engagements. Indigenous nations were fighting not for conquest, but for survival, resisting violent displacement, cultural eradication, and the relentless expansion of European and American powers. These wars were characterized by intense brutality, the involuntary relocation of people, and the loss of life among native communities, driven by colonial desires for land, resources, and control. The ongoing impact of these conflicts is profound, with many indigenous communities still grappling with the historical trauma, loss of land, and the marginalization that resulted from these events. By continuing to use the term Indian Wars, we risk minimizing the gravity of these historical events and the suffering they caused. More accurate and respectful language can deepen our understanding of this history, honoring the resilience of indigenous nations while confronting the legacies of colonization that persist to this day. Adopting terms like wars of indigenous resistance, or even better, nation-specific names, acknowledge the complexity and the humanity of these histories, fostering a more truthful and inclusive narrative.